connections here, and I haven't thought enough about them but hopefully you'll be writing in English so I can read. Yeah, excellent. So I look forward to sort of reading what you have to say about this. I think it's a really fascinating phenomenon. And the other thing is that a lot of novelists are trying to work in television or are working in television. So many of the writers on The Wire, George Pelecanos, Richard Price, Dennis Lehane, are well-established crime novelists. They're not the highbrow literary writers, but within the world of crime writing, they're the best crime writers. They're the ones who are seen as legit in a way. There's a really great show on right now called Justified, which is based on Elmore Leonard's work. And Elmore Leonard is again, a very highly regarded popular crime novelist, and he's written for the show as well. So there's a sense of interplay. Game of Thrones is interesting. It started as a novel series, fantasy novels, and it was co-created by two guys, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, I think is his name. And Weiss was a novelist first and wrote a really, really interesting novel called Lucky Wander Boy, which is a very, very experimental literary novel about video games. And it's a fascinating book. And then he goes on to create a really popular television serial based on a novel. So, I mean, lots of interplay there. Yeah, so I think it's very fascinating. Yeah.
I'm really interested, or I think the chapter from your book, which I read, the introduction, and your two talks, really opened my eyes to how much of the meaning of these series is actually created in the gaps between the episodes,
yeah.
In the subtext, in the paratext, in everything that people say and write about it. And I'm really wondering, how would you envision a kind of interpretive, analytical approach to these series? What would be a way of trying to academically interpret the meaning of these series without closing our eyes for this entire framework in which they exist?
It's a really interesting question because and I'm very clear. I try to be very clear in the book that I'm doing a formal analysis. Poetics approach is inspired by poetics. I'm not trying to do interpretive work, not because I don't think that's important, but because you can't do everything, and I think that it's important to sort of delineate in that way. One of the really interesting challenges of seriality is how to talk about questions of meaning and ethics and representation and the like, knowing that things are still ongoing. So I think a really, really fascinating case of this is Mad Men. Mad Men is a show that is very much about representing a certain past moment in American history in the 1960s. And I feel like so much of how we will understand that show will be based on how it ends up treating the 60s as a whole decade. Because what we know about the 60s, obviously, there's a huge gap between the early 60s and the late 60s in terms of cultural norms, values, and representations, and civil rights movement, feminist movement, etc. In a way, our attempt to do a sort of an analysis of the show's politics is dependent on what's to come. We can't know. I've read critiques of the show's racial politics, and I'm sympathetic to those critiques, but how do we know where it's going? We don't know where it's going enough to be able to say, as a text as a whole, can we judge it? In the same way that it would be really unfair to judge a Dickens novel based on the first 3 chapters and saying, well, this is his political agenda. Well, no, it's a whole thing. But when we talk about a serial television that spans over years and years, well, that whole thing is too amorphous, and we can't not talk about it. I think we can't not think about the ethics of The Sopranos in the first 2 seasons, even though we know there's still more to come, and maybe what happens at the end will change that. And then we're faced with the fact that, of course, it's still being created so that the writers themselves respond to that feedback loop and say, okay, I hadn't thought about that. I need to address that, or, I'm not comfortable with what people are saying about the racial politics, so I need to change in subsequent episodes how I'm going to deal with that. And we certainly see instances of that where given shows will respond to criticism that a show, it's often that, the show doesn't have decent representations of women or of gays and lesbians or racial minorities, etc., and attempt to course correct along the way. Obviously, we still have to treat the whole thing as a whole, but nonetheless, we also have to remember that intent and statements change over time. So the short answer is I have no idea. I have no idea of a way to do it that is satisfactory to both do it in the moment, to be able to have an effective ethical conversation about a show that's still ongoing. And Breaking Bad is another one that I think is really going to depend a lot on what it says at the end about this horrible, horrible person that we've spent all these hours with. Do we want him to be redeemed? Do we want him to be punished? Do we want him to, to escape? What do we want from him? The Shield is an interesting show in this regard. The ending of The Shield is particularly satisfactory and satisfying in how it sort of delivers the character. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a really complex issue, and I'm glad I don't have to deal with it in my book. Yeah.
In relation to the previous question and also to your previous talk,
yeah.
You've been talking a lot about, for instance, fandom from consumers' point of view. But I wonder what it means for the academia, specifically for media studies and for scholarship, because perhaps for an established scholar, it's doing this kind of research. It's, I guess, a lot easier for you than for us scholars under construction.
Yeah, we're always under construction, but yes.
Because, to delve into historical poetics questions, for instance, on a PhD scholarship, it's a lot harder to convince people that this has a sense of urgency or immediacy. So what do you think of that? And if you have any suggestions or advice?
It's hard. I think I think academic tendencies and topics are always shifting, and I think that yes, it may seem. I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to say, and it's also different in different national contexts and disciplinary contexts. I believe right now there's a lot of work being done at all levels, whether being at the senior scholar level or PhD student level, on television and poetics or aesthetics. I think that is a fairly hot realm in the field. Whereas 10 years ago, when I first started thinking about this, it was not. I know there's a PhD student who I'm an external reader on his dissertation that's very much about storytelling techniques and contemporary television, and I think that he's very legitimated and regarded by his department, etc. So I think there's definitely room for that. I think with anything, though, my advice to junior scholars is always, write what you care enough about to write about. Because if you're writing because that's what you want, that's what your advisors tell you need to write about, you're not going to be passionate enough to write good work or to get it done, as the case may be. And then figure out how you can do it that meets people's expectations. I don't think. My guess is that. And certainly in the U.S., the tide has turned enough that it's not hard to write about these issues. Maybe it's taking a little longer in European contexts. But that's not to say that that's necessarily the right thing to be right about, because by the time you finish writing your dissertation and trying to get it published, things may have moved on to the point that it feels saturated in that way. Certainly there are there are topics, and I know people who've written dissertations about topics that at the time seemed like they were important and really relevant, and now are, seem like, they are sort of passé because things shift, or, there were 20 other people writing similar projects. So, I mean, it's really hard to say in that regard. I do think, though, that, the field, in my experience, the field is very open to this type of work. And the debates that we're having are more about the implication and how it fits into other forms, not is it fair to be asking these questions whatsoever, which 10 years ago I think it was more along that line. So I don't know if that answers your question as much.
I just wanted to supplement to the question and your answer that I think, in many ways, Henry Jenkins has so legitimated anchor fandom that it's hard to suggest that in any way that it wouldn't be a plausible PhD project or whatever. And that partly it's also kind of saturated what we do in departments. I mean, in the same way, 10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined having students write fan fictions or produce fan videos as part of their assessment, but now I do it routinely.
Yeah.
So I think that's just changed so hugely that it's not an issue anymore. In some ways, younger scholars, I sometimes feel, are privileged because they're so much more up to date, especially with the TV environment, that I'm sort of constantly rushing to catch up.
Yep.
But I definitely don't think it's an issue anymore about legitimating that type of work. Work on fandom is now, really legitimated, I think, per se.
I think in broad terms that's true. I think that there are still local contexts I've heard of. And this is one of the challenges of any institution is that whether it's academia or otherwise, is that the local dynamics of your individual case might be different. I know people who have run into problems with doing the type of work that they want to do because a senior member of their department is not accepting of that type of work. And I think that in those instances, I mean, the advice I always tell people and have been told to me as well is, if you do good work, it'll end up self-legitimating in that way. And that's sometimes true, but that's sometimes not. And that's always the question, is like, to what degree are you willing to take a risk on something? I mean, a lot of people refer to, in the U.S. system, a lot of people will say, when you're thinking about a project, you might say, well, that's a good book for after tenure. To the sense that, it's either too edgy or too radical or too risky or will take too long or whatever it might take. There's a sense of the projects that would make more sense to wait until there's less riding on it. And that's certainly the case, but you can't always judge what that's going to be. And you also need to remember that what interested you as a pre-tenure project may not interest you when you're post-tenure, or someone else will have written the book that you would have written in that way. So I mean, there are a lot of variables at play. But yeah, I mean, I agree 100% that Henry's work, and specifically, I mean, Henry has been a big supporter and mentor to me as well, and he has to many people, has really helped legitimate the study of fandom to the point that it is mainstream in a way that you don't have to justify it. But that's also because fandom itself is much more visible and mainstream. When he wrote Textual Poachers in the 90s, no one had heard about fan art or fan fiction. These were fringe, marginal, hidden practices. And now most people have heard of it, even if they don't know much about it. And many people who you don't even expect consume it or produce it. So, there's I think that the shifting context is another big part of it. But they go hand in hand. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to return to that question, how to reflect on this ongoing series.
Yeah.
I think I would not find it so difficult because couldn't we say that any moment is good to reflect on this ongoing story, as it may change, they may change the implotment, and so we even need to we reflect on politics, we reflect on persons before they make the decisions and before they die.
And I think that that's definitely true, and I think that that type of reflection